Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stu again, and we are back in VR with Dreams for PS4. This time we're going to get some impressions of the experience in edit mode. I've been doing some conversions of static sculpts into useful gameplay objects, so I will fix one of those up so you can get a feel for operating in the VR space while editing. My first VR video was tilted to the right, so naturally this one is tilted to the left. I thought it was down to my head being tilted, which is still possible, but I think the orientation of my PS4 camera may be at play, but I'll continue working on it. So in VR, the menu is a little different. Normally the menu runs across the top of the screen, and the thermo, when visible, is in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. In VR, the thermo floats in space in the left periphery, and the menu is below the center of your vision. I'm not the biggest fan of this setup, as it means you have to tilt your head down every time you want to look at the menu. One issue you get in VR is that the floor graphic is even more annoying than usual. If you intersect these lines with your face, it feels like it's piercing your skull, so I turn it off. The ideas behind moving around the virtual space in edit are similar to play mode. It's a bad idea to start and stop any motion too abruptly. If you can keep your movement slow and steady, it helps a lot in combating motion sickness. I made a conscious effort to keep my head more still in this video, which I think paid off, and it probably benefited me some as well, so I think trying not to move your head when you don't need to is good advice. However, there are times when you will need to, because head tilt up and down has replaced the right thumbstick in the control scheme as far as camera tilt goes. The rest of the controls are the same, which sets up an unpleasant conflict holding down L1 to elevate and inadvertently trying to tilt camera with the right thumbstick, which also controls elevate in VR as just mentioned. The solution is to simply not touch L1, but that is not the easiest habit to break, nor is attempting to use the right thumbstick to tilt camera rather than tilting your head to do it. Working from above and below are now even more difficult and will probably give you a stiff neck eventually, as you do that by navigating to above or below the object and then looking down or up at it. I think once you get used to it, that method of working will go away and likely be replaced with rotating it into view. This is where the 4-angle view that has been suggested many times would come in handy. Perhaps an ability to teleport between different view angles with a button press? You may already be able to do that, I don't know, because Dreams operates on more of a figure-it-out basis than any real official documentation. When you're working on an object like this floating in empty space, the queasiness factor is minimal, but pressing L1 out of habit can result in unpleasant jolts, so watch out for that. And you will see me do that a number of times in this video. My work here is very simple. I need to make the object on the other end of the connector grabbable and then hook up some logic to report to the end user if the switch is in the on position or not. I've imported a microchip containing the logic I want. One thing about VR is that you get a sense of depth in edit mode that does not exist in non-VR Dreams. So you can tell when you're placing something on the far or near side of something else. I'm turning the grid on so I can rotate this chip exactly. The grid works and feels the same in VR. My, and maybe your, sense of depth is not perfect, so it's difficult to drop something at the precise depth you want, but you can get it pretty close. Microchips and tweak menus have a different feel to them in VR. They are very much in the space. Because of that, I have a much greater tendency to leave them open now so that the information is always available. Stuff that is pinned to screen by default, like tweak menus, feels a lot different because that information layer is not on top of everything in VR, but rather in the VR space. Because of that, those menus can end up in the middle of stuff and they get very distracting. As a result of this, I've gotten into the habit of unpinning everything and leaving it in the space. And what I found is that this works a lot better. So much so that I also do this now outside of VR. At this point, my imp started getting wonky for some reason, and I only know how to recenter the viewport in VR, since it's the same as centering the imp outside of it. If anyone knows how to recenter the imp, or if you can, let me know in the comments. The imp got so far out of whack that I actually had to take the VR headset off and power cycle it. I'm not sure what caused this, but this is the first time this has happened to me in about 8 hours of VR, so I don't think it's common. While I'm on the subject, one tip I have for keeping things centered and level is to gather all of your VR accoutrements around you before going into VR. Get seated and set up for how you're going to operate while using the thing. Put your headset on, then grab your controller or controllers, then turn the headset on and very quickly assume a centered position for the camera. This helps keep from getting misaligned. And looking at the video now, I think what screwed me up may have been tilting my head while typing, because when I come out of that virtual keyboard, the imp is almost sideways. So try to avoid that. Okay, I have power cycled my headset at this point and my imp is corrected. The rest of what I'm doing with this contraption isn't really important since this isn't a toggle switch tutorial, but I did run into a couple of other things I want to show you. Right here I'm all done with the contraption and want to save, but since I've changed what the element does, I want to rename the element. And it turns out that the virtual keyboard setup in the menu system is different from edit mode. In edit, the keyboard and the text box are linked in the spatial axes, but the text box is on a different plane here. Wow, really interesting, right? But if you think about it, this is an indicator of head tilt. So if for some reason you want to get your head straight, just line these boxes up on the x-axis. I want to talk a little bit about working on a scene in VR, but first notice that the picture is still tilted left. And I'm pretty sure that's due to the camera, which was tilted slightly. So if you're trying to capture VR, make sure your camera and your head are straight. So working a scene in VR is different from working on an element, because now you have reference points all over the place that your brain can use for getting confused about why you are perceiving motion and your body is not physically moving. Just moving around like this, there is a huge difference in the amount of motion effect when you have things in view and when you don't. I can spin around like this with very little impact because all I have for reference is the sky. But as soon as I move down into the stuff in scene, it gets no bueno pretty quick at the same movement pace. So first thing you need to know is that moving around in edit with a bunch of stuff in the scene feels a lot like play mode, so you need to be ready for that. It's bad enough that I would say if you have motion sensitivity, maybe do most of your level design outside of VR and then use VR to work on details and perspectives. My opinion about that will probably change slightly as I build up a tolerance for the motion and adjust my habits. But going into this with all your non-VR habits intact, it can get iffy. One thing I've noticed about VR is that it's operating on a different LOD setup. You don't hit the highest LOD level until you're right on top of stuff. This is why VR actually seems sharper than you'd expect, and that's because flecks are invisible except for very loose objects and extreme close-ups. Well, that combined with the lower resolution. This valve and gauge are good examples. The open-close writing on the valve is visible from about 6 feet outside of VR. In VR, it's completely washed out until you're maybe a foot or two away. So if you were wondering how MM was going to maintain frame rate and not impose weird thermal restrictions, I think this is a big part of it. And I think you may see this leading to VR-only elements, because in order to achieve spatial impact without the camera being right on top of something, you need more exaggerated topography on your sculpts. So like here on the bolts, you have good contrast of depth, and that really pops. Same thing with the inside of this electrical junction box. The depth sells it, and this isn't as important outside of VR. By the same token, flat stuff, well, it falls flat. I made this wall specifically to be viewed up close, but its lack of depth makes it highly unimpressive in a VR space. Looks fine outside of VR. While we're on the subject of this wall, let's talk about moving things around. You can do all of the things you would normally do in edit mode in VR, however, when you're grabbing something, it is way more difficult to keep it from drifting in and out of depth as you move it. So much so that I would say don't worry about it. Course move it and then get in closer and adjust when you have more control. Either that or use precise move to keep it in the same plane, but then again you'll likely need to adjust that up close as well. One nice thing about editing in VR is that the sense of depth really helps out with placing stuff. I'm on the grid here, so I'm not making it difficult for myself, but as I do this, I have a good feel for where this thing is in all three spatial axes, and of course you can't say that for non-VR. Puppets and characters are really cool in VR. The depth gives them a more human feel, and the sense of scale helps to emphasize larger characters like this cleric beast by Taxoc20. One big drawback I noticed is that tightly clustered layers of LOD are sometimes very apparent. I'm not sure it's going to make it through YouTube's compression, but the wall on the far side of this scene is shimmering with changes in LOD simply from looking back and forth across its face. I tested this with the VR shadow puppet to see if maybe it was the third person cam that was doing it, but all of these conditions are persistent in first person as well. By the way, the shadow puppet is a nice little first person rig outside of VR too. I also tested the shadow puppet in a regular non-VR scene, and LOD was as you would normally expect, so the puppet isn't a factor. So obviously we are contending with some compromises, but you know what? It's pretty cool that a PS4, Dreams, and PSVR combined means you can easily create your own VR content and distribute it to a waiting audience. That makes it a little more difficult to dwell on the negatives. And just like regular Dreams, as we learn and adjust, we will figure out ways of compensating for the platform's shortcomings, and with PS5 coming later this year, who knows just what the future holds for Dreams, both in VR and out. And also keep in mind that online multiplayer is coming eventually, which will transform this title in a big way, and even some ways we're currently unaware of. So in this video we looked at Dreams VR for PS4 in edit mode, and compared it with non-VR Dreams. Lots more Dreams VR content and just Dreams in general content coming, so stay tuned. But that's all for now. Until next time, I'll see you in the Dreamiverse.